Europe didn't just explore the world, it rewrote it. For thousands of years, the world was a vast, disconnected puzzle. Civilizations rose and fell in isolation. But in the late 15th century, a handful of European nations set sail across uncharted waters. They were looking for new trade routes. What they built instead was a system of global domination. This is the story of how exploration mutated into control. Over the next 10 minutes, we are going to look at how Europe went from sending out a few curious ships to conquering entire continents. We'll break down the rise of the very first global empires, the brutal systems they used to extract wealth, the devastating consequences for indigenous populations, and how this aggressive expansion laid the ultimate foundation for the world economy we live in today. When Christopher Columbus hit the Americas in 1492 and Vasco da Gama rounded the southern tip of Africa to reach India in 1498, the textbook narrative says it was an age of discovery. But discovery is a passive word. What happened next was anything but passive. Initially, the goal was simple: bypass the middlemen. Europe wanted spices, silks, and luxury goods from Asia, but the overland routes were controlled by the Ottoman Empire. They needed a water route, but the moment these explorers realized the sheer wealth and military vulnerability of the lands they found, the mission changed. Trading posts turned into heavily armed forts. Treaties turned into ultimatums. The realization dawned on the monarchs of Europe: why simply trade for goods when you can own the land that produces them? The age of exploration was over. The age of imperialism had begun. Two nations were the first to draw lines across the globe: Spain and Portugal. In fact, in 1494, they literally divided the uncharted world between themselves with the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed with the Pope's blessing. Spain focused its terrifying military machine on the Americas. Conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro didn't just defeat the Aztec and Inca empires, they dismantled them. Using a combination of steel weapons, tactical alliances with rival tribes, and the unintentional biological weapon of European diseases, Spain claimed a massive land empire stretching from modern-day California to the tip of South America. Portugal took a different approach. With a smaller population, they couldn't conquer vast inland territories. Instead, they built a Feitoria system, a coastal empire. They captured strategic ports along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, effectively monopolizing the lucrative Indian Ocean spice trade by controlling the choke points. One conquered the land, the other conquered the sea. But what drove thousands of men to cross dangerous oceans, knowing they might never return? Historians often boil it down to three motivations: gold, God, and glory. Gold. This was the ultimate driver. The European economy was built on precious metals. When the Spanish discovered mountains of silver in places like Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, it ignited a frenzy. The wealth extracted from the colonies was used to fund massive European wars and build spectacular palaces. God. Religion provided the moral justification for conquest. Europe was fiercely Catholic at this time, and the Pope had mandated that newly discovered lands must be Christianized. Missionaries traveled alongside soldiers, often viewing the destruction of indigenous cultures as a necessary step to save their souls. Glory. The final piece was prestige. In the competitive theater of European politics, the size of your empire dictated your power. Owning overseas territories became the ultimate status symbol for a monarch. Claiming a territory on a map is one thing. Controlling it from 5,000 miles away is another. To manage their new empires, Europeans had to invent entirely new systems of administration and, crucially, exploitation. In the Spanish Americas, they implemented the encomienda system. The Spanish crown granted a colonist the right to demand tribute and forced labor from the indigenous inhabitants of a certain area. In return, the colonist was supposed to protect them and teach them Christianity. In reality, it was institutionalized slavery. Millions of indigenous people were forced into deadly silver mines and sprawling sugar plantations. When the native populations began to die off in staggering numbers, the empires faced a labor shortage. Their solution to this problem would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. To replace the dying indigenous workforce, European empires turned to Africa. This sparked the transatlantic slave trade. Over the next few centuries, more than 12 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the ocean under horrific conditions to work the colonial plantations. This era fundamentally reshaped the demographics and ecology of the planet. But out of this unimaginable destruction and suffering, a new reality emerged. The first truly global economy. For the first time, silver mined in the Americas was shipped to Europe, used to buy spices in Asia, and funded the purchase of enslaved people in Africa. The continents were wired together. As the 16th century ended, Spain and Portugal had grown unfathomably rich, and their neighbors were watching. Britain, France, and the Netherlands decided they wanted a seat at the table. They didn't start by conquering new lands. They started by stealing from the Spanish. State-sponsored pirates, known as privateers, raided Spanish galleons heavy with silver. Soon, these new powers formed their own aggressive strategies. They created joint stock corporations, like the Dutch and British East India companies, which were essentially massive, heavily armed corporations given the right to wage war and claim territory on behalf of the state. By the time the 1700s rolled around, the Iberian monopoly was broken. Britain and France were setting up their own colonies in North America and India, laying the groundwork for the massive, planet-spanning empires of the 19th century. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. The actions of these early colonial powers redrew borders, wiped out ancient civilizations, and forced millions into bondage. But they also connected the continents and established the global trade networks we still rely on right now. The modern world wasn't created by chance. It was built by empires. Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper into the empires that shaped our world, like and hit subscribe.